IBUS 75, test 4, final exam. We talked about earlier about the primary trade lane for cargo arriving in the United States from Asia is east-west from Asia, the U.S. And of course, the major port for that is the Port of LA, Long Beach. Port of Seattle, Port of Vancouver, San Francisco to some degree competes with it. The southern route, which would be all water from Asia to the Gulf Coast and East Coast, would go through the Panama Canal. We used to have what were called post-Panamax ships, which were ships that had 12,000 TEUs, that's 20-foot equivalents. Ships couldn't pass through the Panama Canal to go to the Gulf and the East Coast. The country of Panama invested hundreds of billions of dollars to expand over the last decade the Panama Canal so it's wider, with the thought that those ships could go through. And since that time, ships got built even bigger, so there are 18,000 TEU ships that also cannot go through, but the 12,000 TEUs can go by. The major thing that influences whether or not a ship goes through the Panama Canal to the Gulf and the East Coast is the rail rates between the Port of LA and Chicago, primarily, or New York, Atlanta. The railroads, those intermodal rates, kind of control whether or not it's more cost-effective to go via rail from the Port of LA, Long Beach, to those points, rather than those ships going all the way around, okay? So it had an impact on the Port of LA, but not a catastrophic one. If you read my CV, you'll know the answer to question number 3. One of the most common things that gets discussed is the ILWU, which is the Longshoremen's Workers Union, routinely gets accused of causing the congestion and the slow movement of cargo through the two ports. Now, whether work rules could be improved and made more flexible like they have in other areas, they're not the primary reason for the congestion or the slow moving part of the cargo. When these big ships come to the Port of LA and Long Beach, the captain of the ship typically is skilled at getting it from one port to the other. That's really his expertise. What he isn't expert at is the unique quality, the unique things going on in a particular port. Even if you go to a port on a regular basis, between voyages, they change the dredging, they've got different markings, and if you don't have that local knowledge, it makes it more difficult to navigate these big ships in confined spaces. And so the ship's captain that is local, that goes on the ship right when it arrives near the port that brings it in, is called a pilot. I think we talked earlier about, because we don't have a federal maritime policy in this country, like every other developed country does, the number of U.S. flag ships when I graduated 50 years ago from the Merchant Marine Academy was well over 2,000. Today it's under 70. One of the things we talk about is that LA Long Beach is uniquely different than any other U.S. ports for a combination of reasons. Number one, we have a very large population center here that's near to the sourcing of the cargo in Asia. Secondly, we have deep water. Third, we have the real estate infrastructure to build these big terminals. 4, we have the highway and rail system that goes east and west, which gives Port of LA and Long Beach a competitive advantage. No other port has that. Several years ago, there was a major disruption to the cargo movement through the port that got everybody in an uproar. It was several years ago, probably 3 years ago, I think. And they tried to pick on one particular thing and said, well, it's the chassis problem, or it's the ocean carriers, or it's detention and demurrage, or it's the ILWU, or it's, any number of the truck drivers, right? That was the source of the congestion. And in fact, it's never usually one thing, it's a combination of factors that cause these types of congestion. Now, while we're speaking of the ILWU, the Longshore Union, which I have a long history with, their contract and their skills are typically not the issue, okay? What is the issue are their work rules. And so as an example, when you order gangs at a terminal, you have to order through multiple locals. There's a clerk's local, there's a longshore local, there's a different local for walking bosses, there's a different local for machine operators, or different group. You have to order these people, and you have to order them in a large group, combinations. Well, those combinations cost a lot of money. A shift costs a lot of money. So the ILWU's objective is to create work for their members. Now, these are the highest paid non-college educated jobs in the United States, period. Right? They're great jobs. They pay great. They have great benefits. There's a whole reason why people want them. They're hard to get. Okay, so the issue is whether or not, as we look at how do we improve cargo velocity, in other words, move cargo through the facilities faster. A good analogy is the auto manufacturing business, right? They just closed down a plant in Lordstown. Oh, it's the Chinese, it's the Mexican. No, it isn't. It's automation. And it's right to work states, states that don't have unions, different work rules, whatever, right? So normally when you approach the ILWU with a labor-saving activity, like we're going to eliminate a whole bunch of labor by automating something, right? Automating how the cranes operate or automating how you spot trucks or whatever. They, generally speaking, are not happy to do that because that affects the number of jobs they have or the number of hours that they have. A couple of years ago, I had a lady that worked at one of the terminals who entered the industry at the exact same time that I did. And we chatted about, just the industry over the 40-some years that we've been in since containerization in Southern California. And one of the questions that I asked her was, she started out with pretty much the same skill set that I had, but yet I was able to advance much faster than she was. And I asked her the question, in the company she worked for, how many women who had our common skill sets were able to advance at the same rate that I was? And the answer was none. Marine terminal operators, who are the people that run the terminals where these ships dock at, right? Typically, what they're looking for is they're looking for people that aren't particularly creative, aren't particularly independent thinkers. So they're typically not looking for the things we teach in college classes: creative thinking, independence, independent thought, whatever. They're looking for people that are highly compliant. We talked about before that logistics is the physical movement of cargo, which is a subset of supply chain, which is a subset of marketing. We talked about that air cargo is faster and more expensive than ocean carriage. The question is, how many multiples more expensive and how many multiples faster is it? Okay, we covered that. Now let's take a look here. The logistics providers in their hiring and recruitment processes, even if they're trying to hire recent college graduates, they typically like to put them in what they call these management trainee programs, which is a way that they think they can get away with paying them at the minimum wage and get low-cost labor. Typically, I'm not a big fan of that. Okay, we talked about this earlier, that when we do the calculation of a ship on its ability to right itself, which is stability, at the dock, you have to take into account, this is the El Faro case, when it leaves and starts burning fuel, it changes those physical dynamics of the ship. One of our business laws is about adaptable organizations, right? And this Walmart is an expert at this, right? They don't get into long-term contracts with their warehouses, their trucking, whatever. They're always shorter term, 2 to 3 years, because they're able then to adapt to the marketplace because it's much more cost effective. One of the critical things now that Amazon is like great at is what we call order fulfillment. I go online, I find something, I go click, right? And then they fulfill that order, and 2 days later I have it at my house. And that's part of supply chain. That's it. I'm good. That covers it.